International Peace Conference held in San Remo in Italy back in April of 1920 occurred basically 100 years ago. And therefore, it is most appropriate for those who follow international history and international diplomacy to commemorate San Remo this year in 2020. It was at the San Remo conference where the final partitioning of the Ottoman Empire was concluded. It should be recalled that the Ottoman Empire dates back to the 13 and 1400s and finally was dismantled at the end of the First World War. With the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations, which was the main international organization of the time, established by the victors in World War I, created mandates and basically the background for the formation of new states in the Middle East, like Syria and Lebanon, like Iraq, and like the Jewish national home, which would be declared as the State of Israel in 1948. We are particularly grateful to the European Coalition for Israel, based in Brussels, which has created the film and the background for understanding this very important conference. The reason why this is very important is because many people haven't heard of the San Remo conference. Everyone's heard of the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. People have heard of the Geneva conferences after World War II. But does anybody know that in northern Italy, there was this San Remo conference as well? That's why it's very important for us to give attention to a conference that took place 100 years ago, but hasn't lost its relevance. I invite you all to enjoy the upcoming interview, which took place in Abu Tor in Jerusalem, overlooking the old city and, of course, the area of the Temple Mount. San Remo, which was in the headlines of newspapers back in 1920, is as pertinent as ever. And therefore, I imagine you will find this film and the questions that are raised in the interviews that follow it extremely important for today.
Ambassador Gold, 10 years ago, you were concerned about a unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state. And what has changed in those 10 years in that regard?
There still is a danger that the Palestinians will go the unilateral track. And the Oslo agreements are pretty specific about this. That the parties are not supposed to undertake unilateral initiatives. Obviously, if the Palestinians do that, Israel will have to protect its interests in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, in parallel.
Yeah. In the last 10 years, has the signing of the San Remo resolution had anything to do with the diplomatic status of Israel?
People remember that there was a Paris Peace Conference. People remember that after World War II, there were Geneva Conventions signed, which affected international diplomacy for decades. But who remembers San Remo? It's not exactly out there as an issue that most people recall. But that's part of Israel's problem. Why is it that it's fighting for its legitimacy all the time? It's because the international treaties and agreements on which the state of Israel is based have been forgotten. So I think it's the role of every diplomat, and I was the head of the foreign ministry for a period of time. Our role is to remind the international community what are Israel's legal rights, what is the basis for the legitimacy of the modern Jewish state. And for that, San Remo is pivotal.
And here we are on the 100th anniversary of the signing of the San Remo resolution. What can be done to make that more prominent in the diplomatic world?
Well, in 1920, they didn't have social media. But in 2020, they do. And so part of what a good diplomat has to do is educate his followers, educate the international community. That's what I tried to do when I was the ambassador of Israel at the United Nations. But I think we have to do it now with much greater intensity than we ever did before.
So do you see an opportunity right now in the 100th anniversary of the signing?
Well, it might provide an opportunity, but it really depends on the hard work of diplomats. You know, a good diplomat 100 years ago was measured by his ability to write a good, concise cable. A good diplomat today is measured by his ability to protect his country's rights on national television. And taking that into account, that is what Israelis are going to have to do in the future, far more than they ever did in the past.
So would you say the world community or the international community has learned the lessons of San Remo, or is there much more work to be done?
There's a lot more work to be done now. But the places where that work should be concentrated are places like universities. You know, I'm not worried about the students, because the students are open to listening to both sides of an issue. I'm worried sometimes about the professors. And that is something that Israeli diplomats, Israeli ex-diplomats are going to have to focus on in the next period of time as we move from the 100th anniversary of San Remo forward.
You know, when I was reading about that period in history, we have a mandate for Syria, we have a mandate for Iraq, we have a mandate for Palestine. In the last 100 years, there seems to be no issue about the Syrian or the Iraqi mandate, but only about the Palestinian mandate to the British. Why do you believe that is?
Well, there are a number of reasons why that issue has come up. Israel's adversaries have been trying to rob Israel of its legitimacy, of its right to exist. They use international history, they think, to their own advantage. But I think now people will have to learn this history properly and not allow some professor or some media figure to distort what went on 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it was clear as day that the restoration of a Jewish national home was supported by the majority of countries in the world. That was essentially the essence of the Palestine Mandate of the League of Nations, and that reaffirmation of Jewish historical rights was retained by the United Nations in Article 80 of the UN Charter. So I think our people have to learn international history a little bit better and then use it on every occasion, on television, in social media, and wherever that history can be told.
You mentioned Article 80. Article 80 is actually pivotal, isn't it? And it's mentioned in the documentary as well, to the status of the State of Israel.
Well, what happened was you have the rights of the Jewish people to restore, to reconstitute their ancient homeland. And then somebody could say, well, wait a minute, those rights were granted by the League of Nations. After World War II, a new body replaces the League. It's the United Nations. So maybe those resolutions from the League are irrelevant. The UN, when it was founded, recognized that arguments like that might be made. And therefore, they incorporated into the UN Charter, they incorporated Article 80, which basically said all of the rights that were recognized years ago, that contain rights for the peoples of the Middle East and the rest of the world, those rights carry over to the UN period. So the rights that we have, which we can easily point to, are now part of modern history and not just ancient history.
Final question, Ambassador Gold. 100 years after the signing of the San Remo resolution, say you're back at the UN yourself, what would you do to make sure that the San Remo resolution was prominent in the minds and hearts of diplomats around the world?
Well, the first thing you have to do is get a photocopy of it and make sure it's on the desk of every UN delegation. I used to do that when I was at the UN, and point out that this is how the world community viewed the rights of the Jewish people way back in 1920. And then show through Article 80 that those rights were never suffocated, were never removed, were never erased, but are there today. And should be a guide for policy in the future.
Ambassador Gold, appreciate your expertise very
You're
much.
welcome.